The first thing I became aware of was the silence. It was a physical weight, a thick, muffling blanket thrown over the world that deadened the very air in my lungs. My own heartbeat was a frantic, trapped drum against my ribs, a sound so loud and alien in the stillness that it felt like a betrayal. I didn't remember arriving. My memories were a jumbled mess of a rain-slicked highway, the screech of tires, the blinding glare of an oncoming truck's high beams, and then nothing, a void. And then this oppressive, crushing quiet. My name is Alex, or at least it was. It felt like a word belonging to another person from another lifetime, a ghost of an identity that had no purchase here. Here was a place that defied naming, a liminal space that had swallowed reality whole. I pushed myself up from the coarse, gritty ground, my hands sinking slightly into a layer of fine gray dust that smelled of ozone and forgotten attics. The sky above was a perpetual, uniform sheet of bruised gray cloud, featureless and suffocating, as if the very concept of weather had been abandoned. And in the center of this dismal firmament hung the sun. It was a mockery of a star, a tarnished copper coin sealed behind frosted glass, leaching a sickly metallic twilight onto the world below. It didn't illuminate, it stained. Everything was cast in hues of rust, ash, and old blood. This was not the golden hour of nostalgia, it was the hour of corrosion. I stood at one end of a street I knew, and yet did not know. The bones of it were familiar, the silhouette of a place I had visited countless times in the warm glow of a television screen during a happier, simpler childhood. But those friendly, cartoonish shapes had been twisted into a grotesque architecture of despair. This was Sesame Street, but it was a corpse of Sesame Street, picked clean of joy and left to bloat in the sunless air. The brownstones, once so vibrant and welcoming, were now skeletal remains. Their facades were blistered and peeling, great scabs of paint curling away to reveal the rotten wood beneath. Windows were shattered or filmed over with a grimy, opaque residue, their empty eyes staring out at nothing. The famous 123 building, its iconic archway now sagging and splintered, seemed less like a home and more like the entrance to a mass grave. The cheerful reds, blues, and yellows I remembered were now a uniform wash of sepia and decay, the colors of an old photograph left to rot in a damp basement. I took a hesitant step forward, the crunch of grit under my boot echoing with a shocking loudness. The air was cold, a damp chill that seeped through my clothes and into my marrow. And beneath the ozone and the dust there was another smell, faint but persistent, the sweet, cloying scent of mildew and of something else, something organic and vaguely rotten, like wet wool that had been left in a sealed bag for decades. It was the smell of something once alive that had been left to stagnate. And then I saw that the street was not entirely still. Movement flickered at the edges of my vision, shapes that resolved into figures both familiar and horrifyingly wrong. They moved with a slow, ponderous gravity like underwater things or figures in a dream, trapped in routines that had lost all meaning. They were the residents, the citizens of this forgotten neighborhood, and they were broken. My eyes were drawn to the archway of 123. There, standing so still I had initially mistaken him for another ruin, was a giant. It was Mr. Snuffleupagus. His immense size, once a source of gentle wonder, was now a monument to sheer, terrifying scale. His long, shaggy fur, which should have been a rich brown, was a matted, filthy tapestry of mud, cobwebs, and unidentifiable filth. Great clumps of it had fallen out entirely, revealing patches of gray, elephantine skin that was cracked and parched like a dry riverbed. His eyes were the worst. They were milky white orbs, blind and unseeing, sunk deep into a face that was a mask of profound, eternal sorrow. He didn't move, didn't forage, didn't speak. He simply stood there, swaying almost imperceptibly, and from the depths of his massive chest came a low, continuous moan. It was a sound that was less a sound and more a vibration in the air, a frequency of pure, undiluted melancholy. It was the heart of this place, the baseline of its despair. This wasn't the imaginary friend Big Bird had to prove existed. This was a ghost of a giant, a lonely god of this desolate realm, forever waiting for a friend who would never, ever come. This was the forgotten neighborhood, and I was now a part of its silence. The silence of the street was a living thing, a heavy woolen pall that pressed against my eardrums, making the frantic thrum of my own blood the loudest sound in this dead world. It was a silence so complete that it became a noise in itself, a high-frequency hum of absolute nothingness that was more unnerving than any cacophony could ever be. I stood frozen, caught between the monumental weeping grief of the giant by the archway and the yawning emptiness of the street ahead, a corridor of decay that seemed to stretch into infinity. My mind, reeling from the sensory deprivation and the sheer impossibility of my circumstances, clung to the only anchor it had, the need for motion, for some sign of life, however corrupted. And that was when the sound began. It started as a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in the air, a dissonant chord that felt like a needle scratching at the very edge of my hearing. Then it resolved, coiling through the stagnant air with a malevolent clarity. It was a giggle. The giggle. The one I had heard through the tinny speaker of my grandmother's television set a lifetime ago, a sound that had once been the very embodiment of childish delight. But here, in this rusted world, it was a horror. It was that same high-pitched, rhythmic cadence, but stripped of every shred of warmth and joy. It was a sound that had been left out in the rain to rust, now sharp, metallic, and laced with a static that grated against my nerves like a physical file. It was the laugh of a doll whose voice box had been warped by a close lightning strike, a parody of amusement that spoke only of a hollow, mechanized madness. It was coming from below. The giggle, that awful glitching chirp, seemed to seep up from the very cracks in the pavement, rising from a basement window of a building whose door hung off its hinges like a broken jaw. The structure seemed to lean inward, consumed by its own shadow, and the window was a dark, gaping mouth outlined by splintered wood and jagged teeth of glass. An almost physical pull drew me toward it, a morbid fascination that overrode every screaming instinct for self-preservation. Each step was a battle, my feet leaden, the dusty ground seeming to clutch at my boots, trying to hold me back. The smell hit me first, wafting from that dark opening, a nauseating cocktail of ozone, like the air after a devastating electrical storm, mixed with the sweet, cloying stench of burnt felt and old overheated plastic. It was the smell of a childhood toy thrown into a fire, of memories being incinerated. I dropped to my hands and knees, the coarse grit biting into my palms, and peered through the grime-caked lower pane of the broken window. The scene within was a shrine to technological decay. The basement was a cavernous space, lit only by the faint flickering glow of a dozen dead television screens, their glass faces cracked and spiderwebbed. Tangles of wires, thick and serpentine, spilled from eviscerated consoles and consoles, crawling across the floor and hanging from the ceiling like metallic ivy. And in the center of this electronic nest, surrounded by the hollowed-out carcasses of his audience, was Elmo. The sight of him struck me with a force that was both visceral and deeply psychological, a violation of a fundamental memory. His fur, which was once a vibrant, cheerful red, was now matted and patchy mess, faded to the color of old blood, and caked with a grimy dust. It was moth-eaten and bald in places, revealing a dull, plastic underflesh beneath. One of his eyes was a vacant black hole, a void where a button had perhaps fallen out or been clawed away. But the other eye was a cracked and fractured glass lens, and from within its depths a frantic, erratic static flickered and danced, a malicious intelligence staring out at the world it had corrupted. His movements were the stuff of nightmares. He didn't move with the fluidity of a living thing, but in a series of jerky, stop-motion twitches, as if an unseen projector was skipping frames. One moment he was facing a dead screen, the next his head had snapped 180 degrees to face me, the movement too fast, too wrong. The giggling never stopped, a continuous soundtrack loop of faux merriment. "Elmo loves visitors," the thing chirped, its voice a distorted recording, layered with the faint echo of 1,000 other playtimes now lost to entropy. "Elmo wants to play a game. Elmo has a riddle." The static in its eye flared, casting strobe-like flashes across the dusty basement. "What is red and rotting and remembers everything?" It tilted, the stitching on its neck straining audibly, a dry, threadbare sound. I could not speak, could not breathe. The thing answered itself, the voice dropping to a wet, guttural whisper that seemed to bypass my ears and slithered directly into my brain. "The answer is Elmo. And now Elmo asks another." It began to shuffle toward the window, its body moving in those impossible lurches, closing the distance without seeming to cross the space in between. The giggle twisted, warping into a glitchy, high-pitched screech that felt like ice picks in my temples. "What is trapped and forgotten and wants to be remembered?" It raised a 3-fingered paw, the fur worn away to the nub, and tapped the glass from the inside. Tap, tap, tap. "You can be the answer. You can stay with Elmo forever and ever and ever." The final word stretched into an endless digital scream of static. I recoiled, scrambling backward, falling onto the dusty street. I pushed myself up and ran, not looking back, the horrible giggling shriek chasing me, not through the air, but inside my own skull, a ghost in the machine of my mind, a promise of a game that never, ever ended. Flight was a primal impulse, a current of pure adrenaline that overrides all higher thought and leaves only the base, animal directive to put distance between oneself and the source of terror. I ran from the basement window, from the glitching, giggling thing that wore the skin of a memory, and I did not stop. My lungs burned, raw from gulping the chill, foul air, and my legs protested, muscles screaming as I scrambled over piles of rubble and skidded around corners into alleys that were little more than narrow canyons of decay. The metallic giggle seemed to chase me, not as a sound carried on the air, but as a phantom echo imprinted directly onto my cortex, a psychic stain that replayed on a loop behind my eyes every time I blinked. I ran until the stitch in my side was a white-hot knife, until the coppery taste of blood filled my mouth, and only then did I collapse against a wall, its surface rough and damp with a nameless lichen, sliding down into a crouch as I fought to remember how to breathe. The silence rushed back in, that heavy, suffocating blanket. But it was different now. It was not an empty silence. It was a watchful one, as if the street itself had paused to observe my panic and found it mildly amusing. As my heartbeat began to slow from a frantic drum roll to a heavy, terrified thud, a new sensation announced itself, one so mundane and biological that it was almost more shocking than the horrors I had just witnessed. It was a deep, gnawing emptiness in the pit of my stomach, a painful, twisting hunger. It was a stark reminder of my own fragile physicality in a place that seemed to feed on the intangible, on memory and joy. My body, at least, still demanded real sustenance. Driven by this base need, I moved again, but slowly now, with a hunted animal's caution. The streets seemed to shift and change around me, the brownstones leaning in like gloomy, judgmental spectators. I found myself drawn toward an open space, a plaza that might have once been a cheerful gathering spot. Now it was a desolate patch of dust and hard-packed earth, dominated by a single skeletal structure, a market stall. Its striped awning was in tatters, faded to a sickly gray and green, flapping listlessly in a non-existent breeze. The wood of the stall itself was splintered and warped, but it was the sign hanging crookedly above it that sent a fresh jolt of dread through me. The letters were peeling, the colors bled away, but the words were still legible, a ghost of a cheerful jingle now turned into a grim announcement. Cookie Monster's Emporium. The word cookie had been crossed out with a savage, dark streak, but nothing had been written to replace it. The stall was not empty. Behind it loomed a creature of immense, shambling bulk. This was the Cookie Monster, but the name was a pathetic, worthless relic. His blue fur was a matted, filthy nightmare, thick with clumps of dirt, cobwebs, and things that moved with a slow, larval squirming. He seemed larger, swollen with a terrible gravity, his shape less that of a friendly muppet and more of a crude, shaggy golem of hunger. His eyes were no longer googly and wide with comical desire. They were deep, black pits that held no light, no thought, only a bottomless, consuming need. In one massive, three-fingered paw, he clutched not a cookie, but a small, faintly pulsing orb of light. It was about the size of an apple, and it glowed with a soft phosphorescent warmth, throbbing with a rhythm that was unmistakably alive. It was beautiful and terrible to behold. With a slow, deliberate motion that was laden with a grotesque ritualism, he brought the orb to his maw. Nom nom nom. The sound was not the cheerful, cartoonish gobbling of my childhood. It was a wet, grinding, crushing noise, the sound of brittle structures collapsing under immense pressure. The light within the orb flared in a silent, desperate scream, and then winked out, extinguished utterly. A fine, sparkling dust, like the ashes of a forgotten star, drifted from his lips, and for a moment the black pits of his eyes seemed to glow with a faint, satisfied inner light before fading back to emptiness. He had not eaten a cookie. He had consumed a soul. He saw me then. His massive head, which had been bowed over his grim meal, slowly turned. The movement was ponderous, the creak of a great machine. The void of his gaze fixed upon me, and I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air, a sensation of being spiritually measured and found to be a potential source of sustenance. "You look hungry," the thing growled, its voice not a voice, but a low grinding tremor, the sound of continental plate shifting deep underground. It was a voice made of gravel and appetite. "Me have just the thing." A thick, viscous string of drool, shimmering with that same faint soul dust, dripped from his jaw and splattered onto the counter. "Not cookie, better, more filling." He reached a huge paw under the stall and with a disturbingly gentle carefulness produced another orb. This one was different. It was brighter, its light was a frantic, pulsating gold, and it beat against the air like a trapped bird's heart. I could feel its warmth from where I stood, a desperate living heat that called out to the very life force within me. It was horrifying and mesmerizing. "Fresh," he muttered, the word laden with a terrible finality. Come share. For a price." The price was not stated. It didn't need to be. It was in the way those bottomless eyes looked not at my face, but at my chest, as if they could see the faint, flickering light of my own soul caged behind my ribs and were already calculating the crunch it would make. The spell broke. I turned and I ran, the sound of his wet, soul-crunching feast, nom nom nom, echoing behind me, not as a sound, but as a vibration in the fabric of this awful place, a promise of a hunger that could never, ever be sated.